It was just after 1 in the morning when I heard it. 3 sharp knocks against my front door. At first, I thought I imagined it. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, heavy and still. But then it came again, harder this time. I pulled on my robe and made my way to the door, every step echoing louder than it should have. When I opened it, my daughter was standing there. Or rather, she was trying to. Her body leaned against the frame, trembling, her face swollen and streaked with tears. She collapsed into my arms before I could even speak. I remember the way her hair stuck to her damp forehead, the faint trace of blood at the corner of her mouth, and the way her voice broke when she whispered, "Mom, he hit me. He hit me for his lover." My heart stopped. I wanted to scream, to fall apart right there with her. But I didn't. I couldn't. In that moment, something inside me hardened. I lifted her, carried her inside, and laid her down carefully on the couch. She kept shaking, her lips forming words that barely escaped. And all I could think was, this was my child, the little girl I once held when she scraped her knee, the one whose tears I used to wipe away with a promise that I'd keep her safe. I walked into my room, opened the old wooden chest at the foot of my bed, and pulled out the uniform I hadn't worn in years. As I buttoned it up, my reflection stared back at me from the mirror, a reflection I barely recognized. I picked up the phone, dialed a number I had never erased, and when the line clicked open, I spoke only 4 words. The plan begins now. But before I tell you what happened that night, before I reveal how far a mother will go when her child is broken, you need to understand everything that led us here. Because this wasn't sudden. No, this was built piece by piece, moment by moment, until the weight of secrets, lies, and betrayals crashed through my door at 1 a.m. And from that night on, nothing was ever the same. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Don't just watch in silence. Your support keeps these stories alive. I was always the kind of woman people called strong, though I never thought much of it. I worked hard, raised my child, carried burdens quietly, and kept my personal pain tucked neatly where no one could reach it. Life had not been gentle to me, but I never let it show. My daughter, Emily, grew up watching me stand firm in storms, and I think she believed I could withstand anything. Perhaps that's why, when she fell in love, I let myself believe this man she brought home would protect her the way I always tried to. I still remember the first time Emily introduced me to David. He walked in with that polished smile, hand outstretched, every word smooth as if it had been practiced in front of a mirror. He was polite, attentive, even a little charming. He asked about my work, complimented my cooking, and looked at Emily as though she was the only person in the room. I studied him carefully, as mothers do, searching for cracks beneath the polished surface. But that night I found none. To everyone else he seemed perfect. And to Emily he was more than that, he was everything. Their courtship was quick, almost a whirlwind. They laughed easily together, made plans with wide-eyed optimism, and when they announced their engagement, the room filled with joy. I remember holding Emily's hands and feeling her excitement pulse through her skin. She wanted the fairy tale, the one where love was enough to soften sharp edges and build a forever. And as much as I worried about how fast it all was, I wanted that for her too. The wedding was beautiful. The kind that leaves photographs filled with sunlight and promises. David stood tall at the altar, his vows steady, his voice unwavering as he promised to cherish her. Emily's eyes glistened with tears, and I thought to myself, maybe, just maybe, this man would be her safe place. In the months that followed, their life unfolded like the picture of happiness. Sunday dinners at my table, laughter bouncing off the walls, stories shared over steaming plates of food. Emily would sit close to him, her hand resting gently on his, as if she had finally found her anchor. For a while it seemed as though the dream held steady. They took trips together, shared photos of quiet mornings in their new home, spoke of building a family someday. David often carried himself with an ease that made others admire him. Neighbors, friends, even extended relatives all spoke highly of him. Emily is lucky, they would say. He's such a good man. And I would not, because at the time I believed it too. But life has a way of revealing what smiles often hide. The first shift came quietly, almost unnoticeable. Emily began calling less often. At first, I thought it was natural, newlyweds adjusting to life, carving out their own rhythm. But then family dinners became fewer. Excuses slipped into conversations, and I felt the distance creeping in. I remember one evening vividly. Emily came by the house, her smile stretched thin, her hands busy folding and unfolding the hem of her sleeve. Over tea, she mentioned that David had been short-tempered lately, that stress from work made him irritable. She laughed it off quickly, as though afraid I might see too much. He just needs space, she said. He's under pressure. I wanted to press further. to ask why her eyes didn't quite meet mine, but I let it go. I told myself marriages had rough patches, that stress could bend even the strongest of men. Still, the unease lingered. Little by little, I noticed changes in Emily. She visited less, and when she did, she checked her phone constantly, as though afraid of missing a call. Conversations that once flowed freely now stopped short when I asked about her life at home. I could feel her pulling away, slipping into a silence that wasn't like her. And yet, David remained polished in public. When I saw him at gatherings, he was attentive, smiling, quick to offer a hand if someone needed help. People continued to praise him, and each compliment felt like a small weight pressing against my chest. I wanted to believe them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface. The first true crack appeared one night in a hushed phone call. My phone buzzed after midnight, and when I answered, Emily's voice was trembling on the other end. She tried to steady herself, but her words slipped through in pieces. "Mom, we argued," she whispered. "I'm fine, it's just, he gets angry sometimes." I held the phone tighter, straining to hear past her hesitation, past the fear that curled in her voice. I asked her if she was safe. She said yes too quickly, as if rehearsed. I asked if she wanted me to come over. She insisted no, that she just needed to talk, that things would get better. And then she hung up before I could say all the words, pressing at the back of my throat. That night, I sat in the dark long after the call ended, the silence in my house thick with worry. My instincts screamed that something was wrong, but I didn't know how deep it went. All I knew was that the daughter who once came to me with scraped knees and wide-open honesty was now speaking in whispers, hiding behind forced laughter, and carrying something too heavy for her shoulders alone. And then one night she called me in tears for the first time. Emily's tears that night were unlike anything I had heard before. They weren't the tears of someone simply hurt by harsh words. They were the cries of someone breaking under a weight too heavy to bear. Her voice cracked as she tried to explain, yet even through sobs she was careful not to say too much, careful not to reveal too many details, careful as though her own truth was forbidden. She told me David had been different behind closed doors. Not the polished man who smiled at gatherings, but someone who chipped away at her spirit in quiet, deliberate ways. He would mock her ideas, dismiss her opinions with a smirk, and remind her in cutting tones that she was lucky he chose her. At first, she fought back with the fire I knew she carried, but over time, his words found their mark. He criticized her clothes, her cooking, even her laughter. And every time she tried to defend herself, he twisted her words, making her question her own sanity. I listened in silence, my chest tightening with each confession. I wanted to shout, to march into their home and drag her out, but Emily clung to excuses. "He just gets angry sometimes, Mom," she said. "He doesn't mean it. Work stresses him out. He's under pressure." Her voice begged me to believe her, to accept her reasoning, but beneath her words, I could hear it. The fear, the exhaustion, the slow erosion of the vibrant girl she once was. Days turned into weeks, and the changes grew sharper. Emily stopped seeing her friends one by one. People she had grown up with, women who once filled her weekends with laughter, slowly drifted away. When I asked, she told me they were busy, that life had pulled them in different directions. But later, I learned the truth. David didn't like her spending time with them. He would plant seeds of doubt, whispering that they were jealous, that they didn't respect him, that they spoke behind her back. He convinced her that isolation was protection. Every time she tried to reach out, he made her feel guilty. He questioned her loyalty, accused her of neglecting him, until she stayed home just to keep the peace. What once was a circle of support around her became an empty space. And in that emptiness, his control grew stronger. I saw her shrinking before my eyes. The lively, ambitious young woman who once dreamed of traveling, of building a career, of chasing the life she imagined, was fading. She walked with hesitation, spoke with caution, as though every step, every word might trigger a storm. And then one evening, in a rare moment of raw honesty, she looked at me and whispered, "Mom, I feel trapped." Her eyes glistened with despair, her voice breaking as though the admission itself was forbidden. It was the kind of confession that clung to me, even in the quiet hours of the night. I carried her words like a stone lodged in my chest, heavy and unyielding, and though I tried to encourage her, tried to remind her of her strength, I knew something deeper was holding her captive. The truth revealed itself slowly, piece by piece. It began with little things I noticed about David. His phone always turned face down on the table. His sudden late nights, explained with vague mentions of work. The way he would step outside to take certain calls, his voice low and sharp, then return with a forced smile. I didn't confront him then, but I saw. I saw more than he realized. And Emily, though she wanted to ignore the signs, couldn't. She told me she smelled perfume on his shirts, scents that weren't hers. She noticed how he guarded his phone, how he would retreat to the bathroom for long calls, how he suddenly started dressing sharper, cologne stronger, excuses weaker. The breaking point came one night when Emily followed the gnawing suspicion that had been eating at her. She drove to his office unannounced, her heart pounding in her chest, and there in the parking lot, she found him. Not alone. He was with another woman. A woman whose hand lingered too long on his arm, whose laughter floated too easily in the air between them. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Words flew, his mask slipped, and when they returned home, his anger erupted into violence. She came to me the next day, her face marked with the evidence of his rage. She tried to hide it, covering bruises with makeup, but a mother sees what the world cannot. When I asked, she broke down completely. The dam burst, and every secret she had been holding back spilled out. The affair, the insults, the nights of silence broken by his temper. She confessed it all, the shame, the fear, the loneliness she had buried under forced smiles. I held her as she sobbed, my hands trembling though I forced my voice to remain calm. Inside, I was unraveling. Every word she spoke carved into me. Every detail ignited a fury I could barely contain. I had given this man my trust, welcomed him as family, and in return, he had broken my daughter. When her tears slowed and her voice faded into exhausted silence, I kissed her forehead, whispered that she was safe, and promised her things would change. And in the stillness of that moment, as the weight of her pain settled into my bones, I made a vow. I leaned close to her ear, my voice steady, unshaken, and I whispered. And that's when I started planning. It was 1 a.m. when the sound came again, this time louder, more desperate than before. The pounding against my front door rattled the silence of my house, dragging me out of uneasy sleep. I pulled my robe tightly around me, heart hammering in my chest as I hurried down the hallway. When I opened the door, the sight before me stopped me cold. Emily stood there, or rather, she barely stood at all. Her knees buckled beneath her, her face battered, her breath ragged as though each inhale burned her lungs. Her shirt was torn at the shoulder, her hands trembled uncontrollably, and when her eyes met mine I saw something that nearly shattered me, terror laced with shame. Before I could reach for her, her body gave way, collapsing against me, and I caught her in my arms just as she whispered, "Mom." He hit me again. He said it was because of her. Because of his lover. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Rage surged through me, a fire so sharp it burned away any trace of hesitation. I carried her inside, laid her gently on the couch, and brushed the damp strands of hair from her face. Her cheek was swollen, her lips split, bruises already forming along her arm. I pressed a cool cloth against her skin, fighting the sting in my own eyes. She looked so small, curled up in pain. The same little girl who once believed I could fix anything with a hug. And in that instant, I swore to her, to myself, that I would not fail her now. The thought of calling the police crossed my mind, but I pushed it aside. I had seen too many women wait for justice only to be met with paperwork, procedures, delays, and excuses. I had heard too many stories of abusers slipping through cracks, charming their way out, twisting blame until the victim stood alone. No, not this time. Not with my daughter. I wasn't going to gamble with her life while he slept comfortably, believing he had broken her. I rose from the couch, walked down the hallway, and entered my room. At the foot of my bed sat a chest I hadn't opened in years. My hands hesitated over the latch for just a moment before I lifted it, the hinges creaking softly in the quiet. Inside lay the uniform I once wore with pride, a piece of my past that I thought I had left behind. You see, long before I was just Mom, I was something else. I had served as a detective for the city's police department. Years of chasing lies, uncovering truths, and seeing the worst of humanity had hardened me. But when Emily was young, I left it all behind. I wanted a quieter life, one where my daughter didn't have to wonder if her mother would come home safe at night. I folded away the badge, the uniform, the part of me that thrived in the shadows of justice. Now, as I pulled the uniform from the chest, the weight of it settled over my arms like a second skin. It wasn't just fabric. It was a reminder that I wasn't helpless. That beneath the quiet mother Emily saw was a woman who had faced down men like David before and won. I slipped it on slowly, button by button, watching my reflection shift in the mirror. I no longer looked like the woman who stood in her kitchen making Sunday dinners. I looked like the woman who had once walked into interrogation rooms, unflinching, steady, unwilling to back down. I picked up my phone from the nightstand and scrolled through the contacts. Most names had faded into irrelevance over the years, but one remained. A colleague. A friend who had also walked away from the force but who, like me, had not forgotten what it meant to protect. I pressed the number, my fingers steady even as my chest tightened. The line clicked open, a voice rough with sleep answered, and I spoke only 4 words. The plan begins. Now. There was no hesitation on the other end, just silence heavy with understanding. I didn't need to explain. He knew me well enough to hear in my tone what this was about. We agreed to meet the following evening somewhere quiet away from eyes and ears. As I ended the call, I walked back to the living room. Emily was asleep, her breathing uneven, her face pale against the cushions. I covered her with a blanket and sat beside her, my hand resting lightly on hers. In the stillness of that night, I felt the fury settle into resolve. David thought he had silenced her. He thought he had shattered her spirit, hidden his sins well enough that no one would dare challenge him. But he had made one mistake. He had hurt my child. And as I sat there in the dark, my uniform a shield against the storm raging inside me, I whispered to myself the truth I already knew. David thought he could break my daughter, but he had no idea who he was up against. I began my mornings differently after that night. While Emily rested, I moved like a shadow through the house, my mind sharper than it had been in years. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. I simply told her, I'm handling it. And though her eyes searched mine for answers, she trusted me, perhaps because for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw something in me that she hadn't seen in a long time, unshakable determination. The first step was proof. I knew David. He was clever, manipulative, and skilled at twisting stories until the victim sounded like the aggressor. He would smile for the neighbors, charm the officers, and swear Emily was unstable. Without undeniable evidence, he would slip through justice's grasp. I couldn't allow that. So I began documenting everything. While Emily slept, I gently lifted her shirt sleeves and photographed the bruises. I kept my voice steady as I asked her to describe what he had said, how he had done it, every word, every action. It wasn't easy. Sometimes she broke down mid-sentence, her voice trembling, her eyes begging me not to make her relive it. But I reminded her softly, every detail is a weapon. Every truth we put down is a step closer to your freedom. She nodded, wiping her tears, and spoke on. I installed a small camera by the front porch, hidden in plain sight. If he came to the door, if he shouted, if he laid even a finger near her again, I would have it on record. I began carrying a small recorder in my pocket whenever we left the house. Conversations, phone calls, even his voicemails, they became pieces of a puzzle I was assembling. And then, unexpectedly, something happened. As Emily watched me work, as she saw me quietly collecting, documenting, building a case piece by piece, a spark returned to her eyes. One morning she looked at me and whispered, Mom, I feel like maybe I'm not trapped anymore. That moment nearly undid me. To see her shoulders lift just slightly, to see her breathing without the weight of fear crushing every inhale, I knew I was doing the right thing. But gathering proof wasn't enough. Men like David fed on arrogance. He had to be undone by his own hand. I needed him to expose himself, and I knew just how to make him do it. I called him one afternoon, my voice carefully measured, soft, rehearsed. I told him Emily was at my house, recovering, and that I was tired of the fighting. I said I wanted to talk, to clear the air, to see if maybe we could bring the family back together. His pause on the other end told me he didn't quite believe me, but his ego wouldn't allow him to resist. David prided himself on his control, on making others bend. And if he thought he had broken both Emily and me, he would come. I set the trap in the form of a family dinner. A simple evening, on the surface. But behind it lay a web I had been weaving. I borrowed a set of small cameras from my old colleague and placed them strategically, one in the living room shelf, another in the dining area, a third in the hallway where voices carried. I tested them twice, making sure they captured both video and audio without detection. The day of the dinner arrived. Emily was nervous, her hands cold in mine, but I reassured her. Just let me guide the conversation. Trust me. She nodded, though her eyes betrayed her fear. When David arrived, he walked in with that familiar smirk plastered across his face, as if he owned the very ground beneath him. He kissed Emily on the cheek as though nothing had happened, and I felt my stomach twist with disgust. But I smiled faintly, playing my role, offering him a seat at the table. We talked casually at first. Small topics. Food, the weather, idle chatter. I poured him a drink, pretending not to notice the way his eyes darted around, suspicious yet smug. Then, I began to press. I asked him why Emily seemed so unhappy. He laughed dismissive and said, She exaggerates. She's too sensitive. I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. Sensitive? Or maybe you've been distracted with someone else. The glass froze in his hand. His eyes flicked toward Emily, then back to me, and he forced a chuckle. I don't know what you're talking about. But the cameras caught the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers drummed against the glass. Emily sat in silence, her breathing shaky, her eyes darting toward me as if waiting for a cue. I gave one. I leaned back in my chair and said lightly, "Strange. I could have sworn I saw you the other night near that motel on Jefferson. You weren't alone." Emily flinched, his hand gripped the edge of the table, and for a split second, the mask slipped. His voice rose sharp, defensive. "Don't start with your paranoia. You don't know what you saw." But the cameras recorded every word, every twitch of his face. At one point, he leaned close to Emily, his voice dropping to that venomous tone I had heard too many times. "Don't make me remind you what happens when you lie about me." I nearly lunged at him then, but I held my ground. The recorder hidden under the table was capturing it all. His threats, his intimidation, proof, undeniable and unfiltered. Still, the danger of discovery hung heavy. Twice he glanced toward the bookshelf, frowning slightly. My heart skipped each time, but he looked away, too consumed with his own anger to notice the tiny lens watching him. The evening dragged on, tension simmering, but piece by piece he revealed himself. His arrogance made him reckless. He boasted, he threatened, he slipped details he thought we would never use. And all the while the trap was closing tighter around him. When he finally left, his cologne lingering like poison in the air, Emily sagged into her chair, her body trembling. I reached across the table, squeezed her hand and whispered, "It's working. He doesn't even know what he's given us tonight." She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks, but for the first time in a long time, those tears weren't from despair. They were from the fragile, flickering flame of hope. And as I packed away the hidden cameras that night, my hands steady, I knew the plan was only beginning. He thought he had walked into a simple dinner. But in truth, he had just fed the fire that would consume him. I knew the recordings weren't meant to stay hidden forever. Proof is only powerful when it sees the light of day. And for men like David, exposure was a punishment all its own. He thrived in shadows behind closed doors, where charm and lies could shield him. If he was going to feel even a fraction of what Emily had endured, then the mask had to be ripped away in front of the very people he worked so hard to impress. So I planned the gathering carefully, weaving it into the fabric of normalcy. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation announced with banners and threats. It was framed as a simple family meeting, a chance for reconciliation. I extended invitations not just to relatives but to a few close family friends, the ones who had always praised David's ambition, who thought of him as the picture of success. He would never suspect that the very people who believed his act would become witnesses to his unmasking. On the day of the gathering, I watched Emily nervously set out glasses on the table, her hands trembling. I placed mine gently over hers, steadying them. "Tonight, you'll see that you're not alone," I whispered. "Tonight, the truth will speak louder than his lies." When David arrived, he strutted in like a man entering his throne room. He greeted each guest with that polished smile, cracking jokes, patting shoulders, embracing Emily with just enough affection to appear the doting husband. I saw it, the way some guests nodded approvingly, convinced yet again that he was a good man. My stomach tightened, but I held my silence. Dinner began, laughter ringing out around the table, but beneath it I felt the tension coiling like a spring. I waited until plates were cleared, until voices softened into comfortable chatter. Then I stood. My voice was calm, but it carried weight. "There are things we need to discuss tonight. Things that cannot remain hidden any longer." I glanced at Emily. She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the table, but she nodded. It was her silent permission to go on. I pulled out a small remote and clicked it. The television screen in the corner flickered to life. At first, confusion rippled through the room. But then came the voices, the recordings, the images. David's threats, his mocking tone, his confessions of betrayal, and the photos of bruises that no mother should ever have to take of her child. Gasps filled the room. A cousin covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. My brother's jaw clenched in disbelief. And Emily, sweet broken Emily, sat frozen at first until David leapt to his feet. "Turn that off," he barked, his face red, his voice cracking with fury. "This is out of context. Lies. Manipulated." But the evidence played on. Every guest watched as his mask shattered. Every denial he spat was swallowed up by the undeniable sound of his own voice on tape, threatening Emily, belittling her, admitting to his affair. And then something shifted. Emily rose from her chair. Her voice shook at first, but then it steadied, growing stronger with every word. "I was silent for too long," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought if I kept quiet, if I endured it, he'd change. But he never did. And tonight, I won't be silent anymore." The room erupted, not with chaos but with support. Family members who once turned blind eyes to David's charm now stood with Emily, their outrage directed squarely at him. The weight of years of deception fell away, leaving him exposed, humiliated, powerless in the very space he once dominated. He tried to leave, but I stepped in front of him. My voice was low, steady. You can walk out that door, David. But know this, you will not walk away free, because while the exposure was devastating, I had prepared the next step long before tonight. The evidence was already in the hands of someone who knew exactly what to do with it. The very next morning, I walked into my lawyer's office. A woman I had trusted for years, a sharp mind who didn't shy from difficult cases. I handed her everything, the recordings, the photos, the written statements, the testimony of witnesses. She scanned through the files, her expression hardening with every page. This, she said firmly, is enough to bury him legally. The process began quickly. A restraining order was filed, ensuring David couldn't come within 100 feet of Emily again. Divorce proceedings were launched with undeniable evidence of abuse and infidelity. His reputation, once carefully curated, began to unravel in the community. The whispers spread fast. People who once praised him now avoided him. Colleagues began to distance themselves, and soon his employer had no choice but to cut ties. And when word reached his lover, she too abandoned him. Men like David feed on power, but when stripped of their charm, their money, and their lies, they are nothing more than hollow shells. She walked away, leaving him alone to face the ruin he had built with his own hands. But as I sat across from Emily, watching her sip her coffee with a steadier hand than I had seen in months, I knew this wasn't the end. The public had seen him fall. The law was now tightening its grip. But deep inside me burned a truth I couldn't ignore. He had tried to destroy my daughter. He had laughed at her pain, paraded his betrayal, and raised his hand against her more times than I could count. What he had lost so far was only the beginning. I leaned back, my voice quiet but certain, almost as if I were speaking to myself. He thought this was over. But I wasn't done yet. I always believe justice wears many faces. Sometimes it comes through the courts, sometimes through the whispers of a community, and sometimes it comes in silence, like a shadow that moves unseen until it finally chokes the last bit of light from its target. For David, I had already stripped away his mask, his reputation, and his grip on my daughter. But deep down I knew men like him. They crawl back. They reinvent themselves. They find another stage, another victim. I couldn't let that happen. The public exposure was only part one. The legal process was part two. Silent revenge. This was the final act. I began quietly, the way a surgeon studies the body before making the first incision. David was reckless, not only in his marriage but in every corner of his life. His arrogance didn't stop with Emily. It spilled into his finances, his job, his relationships. And because of my years of experience, connections I had earned, people I had helped, I knew exactly where to look. Through an old friend in law enforcement, I requested a quiet review of David's business dealings. Nothing formal at first, just an informal glance. Within days, cracks appeared. Unreported income, discrepancies in his taxes, payments to accounts that didn't align. Fraud hides in the places people think no one will bother to check, and David had left trails everywhere. Next came the affairs. The woman he had flaunted was only one of many. I reached out, not to confront but to converse. Some ignored me, but others spoke freely once they realized I wasn't threatening them. They told me stories of money borrowed and never repaid, of promises broken, of manipulation that looked eerily familiar to what Emily had endured. I gathered these accounts, not with anger, but with a quiet patience. Each voice was another thread in the net I was weaving. Then came the final blow. I contacted his employer, not directly, but through the right channels. I didn't scream or beg for them to take action. Instead, I slid the documents forward. Proof of misconduct, abuse, financial recklessness. The company had no choice. A man like David wasn't just a liability, he was a ticking bomb. His termination was swift, and the ripple spread fast. He tried to recover, of course. Tried to talk his way out, claim he was the victim of a vengeful wife and mother-in-law. But when financial regulators began to circle, when debt collectors came calling, when whispers of his fraud reached potential employers, doors closed in his face one after another. His phone stopped ringing with opportunities, and instead rang with demands. And I never once raised my voice. I never confronted him in the street, never threatened him to his face. My revenge wasn't loud. It was precise, methodical, unstoppable. Meanwhile, Emily began to rebuild. Slowly, painfully, but with courage that left me in awe. She took classes again, the ones she had abandoned when David's control had tightened. She started painting, something she hadn't done since college. She laughed more often, sometimes in small bursts that caught even her by surprise. And one evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun fade, she turned to me and said, "Mom, I feel like I can finally breathe." That was the moment I knew my silent revenge had done its job. It wasn't just about punishing David. It was about clearing the path for Emily's life to bloom again. And as for David, the last I heard, he was renting a small apartment on the edge of town, jobless, drowning in legal troubles, his so-called friends nowhere to be found. The man who once strutted through life with a smirk now avoided eye contact in grocery store lines. And I didn't need to see him to know it. I could feel it in the silence that followed. I never gloated. I never boasted about what I'd done. Revenge, in its truest form, doesn't need applause. It doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be final. And for David it was. I watched her relearn how to be herself. It was not sudden. It came in small, courageous moments. The first time she walked into a bookstore alone and stayed until closing. The first night she slept through without waking in a panic. The afternoon she painted a canvas and didn't throw it away. Each tiny victory gathered into something larger. A slow reclaiming of a life that had once belonged to her without apology. She began to make plans again. Not the timid, hushed kind she used to murmur when she was afraid of provoking him, but loud, unapologetic plans that filled her with light. She enrolled in a workshop for graphic design, something she had always wanted but postponed when David's demands tightened like a noose. She reconnected with a friend from college who took her to an art show, and they laughed until their sides hurt the way women do when the weight sitting on their chests finally loosens. I watched those laughs, memorizing them as if they were a map back to the girl who once dreamed without limits. We rebuilt routines. Mornings filled with coffee on the porch, evenings with music low in the background while she cooked something experimental, and asked for my honest opinion. She learned to speak in ways that did not shrink her or ask permission. When anger or fear surfaced, she let the feelings pass through her instead of letting them settle and take root. I taught her how to write down what she feared and then burn the page, a ritual she found strangely freeing. She folded the small ashes into the earth beneath a maple tree in our yard and watched new green push through the soil, as if life itself was answering our quiet demand to move forward. There were hard days, of course. Nights when old memories returned with a violence that jolted her awake, or days when a storefront window reminded her of a face she no longer wanted to see. We kept counseling appointments, sometimes together, sometimes alone. She found a therapist who listened without judgment, who gave her tools to breathe through panic and to speak with boundaries. Legal matters continued to complicate life. A restraining order here, a court date there. Each step necessary and heavy, but each also a brick removed from the wall that had trapped her. I sat with her through hearings, held her hand in waiting rooms, and let her cry when the weight of it all became too much. As she regained footing, she explored her independence with a fierce curiosity. She leased a small studio near the river, a space with large windows and sunlight that seemed to warm the paint on her canvas. The first time she let her friends come over, she announced it like a declaration. "Come by tonight. Bring whatever you want. No rules." The room hummed with conversation and the smell of takeout, and I sat quietly in the corner, watching my daughter move through her own life with the confidence of someone who had earned every step. Neighbors, once polite and distant, began to see who she truly was. She volunteered at the local community center, teaching art to teenagers who needed an outlet. Watching them bend over sketches, bright and unguarded, she would offer gentle guidance, and I could see how giving back mended something inside her. Helping others became part of her healing. It gave meaning beyond the wounds, and allowed her to claim a future that had nothing to do with David. When the noise around his downfall finally dimmed, when he no longer held any sway over social circles or business contacts, there was a quiet satisfaction I did not announce. My work had never been about revenge for revenge's sake. It had been about preventing a cycle from repeating, and about making sure that the man who had hurt her could not hurt another in the same way. And in that silence I found a strange peace. The world simply continued. People went to work, new complaints arose, small joys arrived. I played my part and then stepped aside, letting life move forward as it must. Friends who had drifted away returned, some awkward at first, then earnest when they saw her strength. Old wounds in the family began to close as people confronted their own fears and made different choices. We learned to set boundaries and to name what we would no longer tolerate. In those conversations I watched relationships reconfigure, not always perfect but truer for the honesty that finally replaced pretense. There were moments of quiet triumph I cherished. The day she signed a lease on her own, handwriting steady and proud. The Saturday morning she taught a paint class to a group of women and left with more business cards than she had imagined. The evening she sat across from me and spoke of love without trembling, saying, "I know what I deserve now." I taught her how to watch for the early signs of control in future relationships, not because I wanted to frighten her, but because knowledge is a kind of armor. We talked about red flags in practical terms. Excuses that isolate, questions that erode confidence, laughter used as a weapon. She listened not with the shame she once carried, but with the clarity of someone who had lived the lessons. On evenings when the house was quiet, we would sit with mugs of chamomile and talk about the small things, recipes we wanted to try, places to visit, people to forgive and those we would not. Forgiveness did not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it meant accepting that a person had been part of your past, and choosing peace over perpetual conflict. We practiced letting go of what we could not control and celebrating what we could. I began to teach her how power can be exercised without noise. There is a certain kind of strength that does not seek applause. It acts carefully, precisely, and with restraint. It does not humiliate, it repairs. It does not score points. It ensures safety. Watching her adopt that ethic filled me with a quiet pride. She moved through the world with a dignity that was hard-won and luminous. Time, as it does, softened the edges of the worst days. The scar tissue remained. Some wounds are visible only in memory, but they no longer dictated the terms of her life. She found joy in small rebellions. A haircut that made her laugh. A dress she bought because it made her feel bold. A trip with friends to a coastline she'd always wanted to see. Each instance was a stitch in the new fabric of her existence. I learned too. I learned how to ask for help and how to accept it without guilt. I relearned the rhythms of patience and the discipline of not carrying every burden alone. I volunteered in ways that kept me connected to community and to purpose beyond my role as protector. I forgave myself for the times I had not seen and moved forward with the humility of someone who had acted when it counted. At nights when memory pressed close, I would think of the moment at the door and the cold rinse of panic that once gripped me. I would also remember the sound of her voice when it first steadied again, the way she declared small freedoms, and the texture of her laughter returning. Those memories became a map of cause and effect, proof that courage can be taught, that systems can be challenged, and that love, when combined with resolve, can alter the course of a life. At 1 a.m., my daughter collapsed at my door. At 1 a.m., I became her shield. And at 1 a.m., I swore no one would ever break her again. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Share it with someone who needs to hear that silence does not equal consent, that there are ways to act with care and precision, and that a life can be rebuilt even after the darkest nights. Your voice matters. Leave a comment, spread the word, and stand with those who are finding their way back. I stood there, watching the silence settle after the storm we had lived through. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of secrets, but the silence of peace. For years, betrayal had been the shadow trailing behind my daughter. But now, standing by her side, I realized that shadows only exist because light still shines somewhere. Betrayal cuts the deepest when it comes from the people you once trusted most. It is not the stranger on the street who leaves scars on your soul. It is the hand you once held, the face you once cherished, the voice you once believed in. And yet, through that pain, through that heartbreak, through those endless nights of tears and silence, there emerges something even stronger. A woman's resolve. A mother's shield. A daughter's rebirth. Emily was not the same fragile girl who once trembled at the sound of her husband's footsteps. She was not the woman who once apologized for bruises that weren't her fault. No. She was a woman who had been broken, yes, but broken things, when mended with love and patience, become unshakable. And I had the honor of watching my daughter rise, piece by piece, from the ashes he tried to bury her in. As for me, I learned something too. Strength is not always in shouting. Revenge does not always come with flames and fury. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is silence. The kind of silence that exposes truth. The kind of silence that leaves the guilty choking on their own lies. The kind of silence that builds walls around the people you love, while letting the world watch the abuser crumble into dust. Together, Emily and I built a new chapter. We did not erase the past, because scars tell stories. We simply refused to let those scars define the future. And so day by day she smiled more. She laughed again. She walked with her head high. And when I looked into her eyes, I no longer saw fear. I saw fire. At 1 a.m., my daughter collapsed at my door, beaten and broken. At 1 a.m., I swore no one would ever break her again. And at 1 a.m., a mother became more than a mother. She became her daughter's shield, her voice her silent weapon. This is not just our story. This is the story of every woman who has been silenced, every daughter who has been betrayed, every mother who has stood in the shadows, watching and waiting for the moment to act. To you I say this, you are stronger than you think. And when you stand, you do not stand alone. If you made it this far, don't leave without giving this video a like, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I truly want to know how far this story reached. Your voice makes these stories powerful. And as the night fades and morning breaks, remember this. Sometimes the greatest victories are not the loudest battles, but the quiet steps taken by women who refuse to bow, who refuse to be broken, and who choose instead to rise. Emily and I walked away hand in hand, not as victims, not as survivors, but as women who reclaimed everything that was stolen. And that is how betrayal was silenced, forever.